Welcome back to Vanished Americana. If you are deeply fascinated by the hidden realities of the 20th century, and if you want to understand the true, unvarnished history behind the nostalgic photographs of our past, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Today, we are stepping past the pristine white picket fence, walking through the freshly painted front door, and examining the ultimate defining symbol of the 1950s American dream. The absolutely spotless, immaculate suburban home. When we look at vintage magazine advertisements or classic television shows from the mid-century, we are consistently presented with a very specific, highly manufactured vision of domestic life. We see smiling women wearing pristine floral dresses, gracefully pushing lightweight vacuum cleaners across spotless carpets, or lightly dusting a gleaming mahogany coffee table without breaking a single sweat. The entire house looks as though it cleans itself. But to truly understand the daily reality of the 1950s housewife, we have to aggressively tear down that comfortable pastel-colored facade and look at the brutal, physically exhausting, and often highly toxic manual labor required to maintain those impossible societal standards. We currently live in an era of unprecedented cleaning convenience. We have robotic vacuums that map our floors while we sleep, disposable wet wipes for every conceivable surface, and a massive aisle in the supermarket dedicated to gentle, eco-friendly sprays, heavily scented with natural lavender or citrus. But the 1950s home was cleaned using what can only be described as a harsh industrial-grade chemical arsenal. Long before the widespread awareness of indoor air quality or the invention of non-toxic alternatives, the mid-century housewife waged a daily, relentless war against dirt using heavy, unadulterated chemicals that would require protective gear to handle in a modern workplace. When a woman opened her cleaning cupboard under the kitchen sink, she wasn't reaching for a mild, multi-surface spray. She was reaching for heavy glass jugs of pure, stinging ammonia, highly corrosive lye, and completely unregulated, industrial-strength liquid bleach. The scent of a clean home in the 1950s was not the smell of an ocean breeze or a mountain spring. It was the sharp, pungent, eye-watering odor of a chemical burn. If there was a stubborn grease stain on the stove or a deeply soiled collar on a husband's white shirt, the housewife frequently turned to carbon tetrachloride, a highly effective, incredibly dangerous dry cleaning solvent that was completely legal to buy over the counter and use in an unventilated kitchen. Today, carbon tetrachloride is strictly banned due to its severe toxicity to the human liver and nervous system, but back then, it was just another trusted tool in the cleaning bucket. Furthermore, the modern luxury of cheap disposable rubber gloves was not a universal standard in the early 50s. Women plunged their bare hands directly into buckets of scalding hot water, heavily laced with harsh, skin-stripping detergents day after day, year after year. The term dishpan hands was heavily popularized in lotion commercials, but it barely scratched the surface of the physical damage inflicted on the skin by the daily use of these abrasive compounds. The women of this era did not just gently wipe surfaces, they aggressively scoured their homes. They spent hours on their hands and knees, scrubbing heavy linoleum floors with abrasive steel wool pads until their knuckles ached and their backs burned. The sparkling, immaculate 1950s home that we nostalgically admire in old Kodachrome photographs was not the result of easy, modern convenience. It was the direct, undeniable result of millions of women engaging in a daily, grueling, and chemically hazardous battle against the elements, armed with nothing but sheer physical stamina and an uncompromising dedication to the standards of the era. If there was one specific day of the week that universally struck a deep, exhausting sense of dread into the heart of the 1950s housewife, it was Monday. According to the strict, unwritten rules of mid-century domestic management, Monday was absolutely non-negotiably wash day. Today, doing the family laundry is largely a passive background chore. We effortlessly toss an enormous pile of mixed clothing into a massive computerized machine, push a single digital button, and walk away to live our lives. But in the early to mid-1950s, before the fully automatic washer and dryer sets became a standard, affordable feature in every single suburban basement, doing the laundry was an all-day, physically punishing, and genuinely dangerous marathon of manual labor. The centerpiece of this weekly ordeal was the wringer washer, a heavy, intimidating mechanical beast consisting of a large, churning metal tub of water and two heavy motorized rubber rollers mounted directly on top. The process began early in the morning by boiling massive pots of water on the kitchen stove and manually grating harsh, heavy bars of lye soap into the machine. Once the heavy woolen trousers, thick cotton dresses, and massive bedding sheets were thoroughly agitated in the scalding, soapy water, the true danger began. Every single heavy, soaking wet item had to be manually lifted from the boiling water with wooden tongs and meticulously, carefully fed by hand through the motorized rubber wringers to squeeze out the excess water. This machine did not have advanced safety sensors. If a woman momentarily lost her concentration, the wringer would ruthlessly pull in her fingers, her hand, or her long hair, causing severe, sometimes permanent crushing injuries. It was a well-known, deeply feared hazard of the suburban basement, demanding absolute, terrifying focus for hours on end. But simply washing the clothes was only the first grueling phase of the battle. The 1950s standard for cleanliness demanded that a husband's work shirts and the family's bed linens must not just be clean, they had to be blindingly, perfectly white. To achieve this, the housewife employed a fascinating, largely forgotten chemical trick known as bluing. Because constant washing with harsh soaps caused white fabrics to turn a dingy, unpleasant yellow, women added a few precise drops of Mrs. Stewart's bluing, a vivid dark blue liquid dye, into the final rinse water. The slight blue tint counteracted the yellowing, creating an optical illusion that made the fabric appear dazzlingly, crisply white in the sunlight. Once the heavy, wet clothes were finally wrung out, they were hauled outside in massive, backbreaking woven wicker baskets. Rain or shine, freezing winter or blistering summer, the laundry had to be hung out on the backyard clothesline. In the bitter, freezing depths of January, housewives would stand in the snow, their hands completely numb, pinning wet cotton sheets to the line, only to watch them instantly freeze solid as a wooden board in the winter wind. When they were finally brought back inside, the stiff, frozen clothes had to be draped over chairs near the radiator to slowly thaw. And the ordeal still wasn't over. This was an era dominated by heavy natural fibers like cotton, linen, and wool. Synthetic, wrinkle-free fabrics were not yet the norm. This meant that on Tuesday, the housewife faced an enormous, intimidating mountain of ironing. Every single item, from the husband's stiffly starched collars and the children's school uniforms, all the way down to the bedsheets and the men's cotton boxer shorts, had to be painstakingly pressed by hand with a heavy, solid iron. It was a relentless 2-day cycle of boiling water, crushing rollers, freezing winds, and searing heat that demanded the physical endurance of a professional athlete, completely masked behind the polite, smiling facade of the neighborhood housewife. When we examine the immaculate, beautifully decorated interiors of a 1950s living room, we are often looking at expansive hardwood floors polished to a mirror shine, covered by heavy, intricately woven Persian rugs or thick braided carpets. Maintaining these surfaces to the exact, unforgiving standards of mid-century society required an incredible amount of analog ingenuity and sheer, brute physical force, long before the invention of the lightweight, cordless, high-suction vacuums we completely take for granted today. While early, incredibly heavy vacuum cleaners certainly existed, they were cumbersome, difficult to drag up a flight of carpeted stairs, and often lacked the raw suction power required to truly deep clean a heavy rug. Therefore, the 1950s housewife relied on traditional, highly physical methods of carpet warfare. At least twice a year during the massive undertaking known as spring cleaning, those enormous, incredibly heavy area rugs had to be completely rolled up, dragged out the back door, and hoisted over a sturdy reinforced clothesline or a dedicated wooden beating rail. Then, armed with a heavy woven rattan or wire carpet beater, the woman would physically strike the rug with all her might, creating massive, choking clouds of dust that drifted across the neighborhood. She beat the fabric until her arms were physically shaking and the rug finally stopped giving off dust. For the daily indoor maintenance of carpets, women utilized a brilliant, highly resourceful, and entirely forgotten hack to to prevent dust from simply becoming airborne and settling on the furniture. Before sweeping a large rug with a stiff-bristled broom, the housewife would save her used, damp tea leaves from breakfast, or take yesterday's daily newspaper, soak it in water, tear it into small, damp shreds, and violently scatter them completely across the carpet. As she swept the floor, the damp leaves or heavy, wet paper naturally grabbed and trapped the fine dust, rolling it into manageable clumps that could be easily swept into a metal dustpan, leaving the room entirely dust-free. When it came to the gleaming hardwood floors and the vast expanses of kitchen linoleum, the required labor was even more demanding. The modern concept of casually walking around the kitchen with a lightweight spray mop simply did not exist. Achieving the required perfectly reflective shine on a mid-century floor meant that the woman had to physically get down on her hands and knees. She applied thick, pungent, chemical-smelling paste wax directly to the hardwood, rubbing it firmly into the grain in small, exhausting, overlapping circles. Once the thick wax had dried to a dull, hazy finish, the agonizing process of buffing began. She either used heavy, clean rags, rubbing the floor by hand until her shoulders burned with lactic acid, or she wrestled with a massive, incredibly heavy electric floor buffer that fought her like a wild animal, threatening to spin entirely out of control and smash into the baseboards if she lost her grip for a fraction of a second. And the analog ingenuity extended to every pane of glass in the home. Commercial glass cleaners were considered an unnecessary luxury when the perfect solution was already sitting in the pantry. Housewives mixed a potent, eye-watering bucket of warm water and harsh white vinegar. They didn't use soft microfiber cloths. They used tightly crumpled balls of the daily black and white newspaper. The harsh vinegar effortlessly cut through the thick layer of greasy smoke and smog that coated mid-century windows, while the heavy carbon ink of the newspaper acted as a microscopic, gentle, abrasive polish, leaving the glass completely invisible and entirely streak-free. Every single pristine surface in that home was a direct testament to a woman's physical labor, achieved through chemical burns, aching joints, and a brilliant, frugal resourcefulness that has completely vanished from the modern domestic landscape. The most exhausting aspect of maintaining the mid-century home was not the harsh ammonia, the terrifying wringer washer, or the grueling hours spent scrubbing the floor on hands and knees. The heaviest burden these women carried was the immense, crushing, and relentless psychological weight of societal expectation. The 1950s were defined by a rigid, heavily enforced culture of appearances. It was absolutely not enough for a house to simply be clean. It had to appear as though it had been cleaned effortlessly, as if by magic. The massive cultural propaganda machine, driven by glossy magazines like Good Housekeeping, patronizing television advertisements, and the silent, highly judgmental gaze of the neighborhood women, dictated an impossible, flawless standard of domestic perfection. The mid-century housewife operated under a strict, unforgiving daily deadline, 5 o'clock in the evening. This was the sacred hour when the commuter trains arrived from the city and the husbands began pulling their heavy sedans into the suburban driveways. For the preceding 8 hours, the housewife had been engaged in what was essentially toxic, heavy manual labor. She had been sweating over a boiling laundry vat, inhaling caustic fumes, and beating rugs until her arms ached. But as the clock heavily ticked toward 4:30, a frantic, desperate, and deeply practiced transformation had to occur. The strict societal rules explicitly stated that a husband returning from a hard day at the corporate office should never, under any circumstances, be greeted by the harsh reality of domestic labor. The house could not smell like strong bleach or sour floor wax. It had to smell warmly of a perfectly roasted chicken or a freshly baked pie. The woman herself had to undergo a complete metamorphosis. She quickly stripped off her soiled, damp, and chemical-stained house dress, or heavy work apron. She aggressively scrubbed the pungent smell of lye and ammonia off her raw, red hands. She quickly brushed her hair, powdered her nose, and applied a fresh, bright coat of perfectly red lipstick. She slipped into a clean, crisply ironed dress, perhaps fastened a delicate string of pearls around her neck, and prepared a cold, perfectly mixed cocktail. When the heavy wooden front door finally opened at 5 o'clock, she was expected to be standing there looking as fresh, serene, and unbothered as a model stepping directly out of a Sears Roebuck catalog, ready to listen to her husband's day. The absolute exhaustion, the chemical burns, and the sheer physical pain of her unpaid, completely unrecognized labor were to be completely hidden, swallowed down, and never discussed. This is the profound, deeply hidden tragedy of the perfect 1950s suburban illusion. These women were the invisible, silent, uncomplaining engines that powered the greatest economic boom in American history. They maintained the pristine backdrop against which the post-war American dream was successfully projected, and they did it at the immense cost of their own physical comfort and psychological freedom. When we look back at the gleaming vintage kitchens and the spotless living rooms, we must actively strip away the nostalgic, soft focus filter. We must remember that those pristine homes were not a reflection of leisure. They were the battlegrounds of a fiercely dedicated generation of women who worked themselves to the absolute bone because society gave them absolutely no other choice. They were incredibly strong, they were vastly resourceful, and they survived a grueling domestic reality that would completely break the modern homeowner in a matter of days. We owe them an immense debt of historical honesty and profound respect. Thank you for joining me in the archive today. Please leave a comment below sharing the stories of how your own mother or grandmother managed to keep a home during this grueling era, and I will see you in the next episode of Vanished Americana.